Something unusual just happened in Washington. Something that, until recently, looked almost impossible. Republican senators, not Democrats, Republican senators, pushed back against Donald Trump. Hard. And not quietly. Not behind polite statements. Not through anonymous grumbling alone. They openly revolted against one of his priorities. They delayed key legislation. They questioned his judgment. They challenged the timing. They challenged the politics. And in some cases, they challenged the morality of what he was trying to do. For years, Trump's grip on the Republican Party has seemed ironclad. He could shape primaries, destroy careers, set the agenda, force loyalty, and make even skeptical Republicans fall back in line. But this week raised a new question, a serious one. Has Trump finally found the limit of his control? Because what exploded in the Senate was not just another policy dispute. It was a collision between Trump's personal political instincts and the survival instincts of Republican senators heading into the midterms. New York Times, Washington Post. And if that sounds like inside baseball Washington drama, think again. Because if Trump is losing even part of his ability to command Senate Republicans, that could affect everything. Immigration, Iran, congressional control, the 2026 midterms, and the future shape of the Republican Party itself. So what exactly happened? Why did it happen now? And is this a temporary outburst or the beginning of something much bigger? Let's break it down. At the center of this political firestorm is a proposed $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund. On paper, the idea was presented as compensation for people who were unfairly targeted by the government. The fund emerged as part of a settlement connected to Trump's lawsuit over the leak of his tax returns. According to the BBC, the arrangement involved Trump dropping a $10 billion lawsuit against the IRS, while the Justice Department outlined a fund worth roughly $1.776 billion, administered through a 5-member commission, with most of those members appointed by the Attorney General. Now pause there, because that might sound technical. It might sound legal. It might sound bureaucratic. But politically, it was dynamite. Why? Because the question immediately became, who exactly could get paid? And critics inside both parties quickly zeroed in on the most explosive possibility of all, people connected to January 6th. That changed everything. New York Times, Los Angeles Times. For many Republican senators, this was not some abstract spending fight. This was personal. These were lawmakers who had been in the Capitol on January 6th. Lawmakers who had fled. Lawmakers who had watched police officers attacked. And now they were being asked to tolerate a federal fund that, in their minds, could end up rewarding people who helped terrorize their workplace. That is why the backlash was so immediate and so emotional. Mitch McConnell called it utterly stupid and morally wrong. Thom Tillis blasted the idea of using taxpayer dollars to compensate convicted felons and thugs who attacked police. John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, said he was not a big fan and did not see the purpose of the fund. Kevin Cramer reportedly described it as politically unexplainable. That is not normal Republican criticism of Trump. That is the language of a party hitting a pressure point. CNN's reporting is crucial here because it suggests the fund was not the only problem. It was the breaking point, the latest straw, the moment when a lot of long-building resentment spilled into the open. According to CNN, Senate Republicans were already frustrated by a series of moves they saw as politically self-destructive. Trump had been focused on personal projects and personal grudges. He had endorsed against Senator John Cornyn in Texas. He had celebrated the defeat of Senator Bill Cassidy, a longtime target because Cassidy voted to convict him after impeachment. And at the same time, the White House was also pressing for money related to Trump's ballroom project and the Secret Service, feeding concerns that Republican priorities were drifting into territory that looked self-serving and out of touch. Put simply, many Republican senators believe they are walking into a difficult election season. Voters are worried about rent, groceries, gas, war, the economy. And instead of sharpening a message around those issues, Trump keeps dragging the conversation back to himself. That is why this revolt matters. It is not just ideological. It is electoral. These senators are looking at the map, looking at the polls, looking at swing voters, and asking a brutal question. Is Trump helping us hold power, or is he making our job harder? CNN Los Angeles Times, one senior GOP aide quoted by CNN put it bluntly. All 53 Republican senators are not happy right now. That is a remarkable quote, because even when Republicans disagree with Trump, they usually do not sound unified against him. This time they did. This is where the story becomes more than symbolism, because the Senate backlash had real consequences. According to the Washington Post, Republicans postponed plans to pass major new funding for immigration enforcement after frustration over the anti-weaponization fund derailed the bill. The Wall Street Journal similarly reported that more than a dozen Republican senators grilled acting Attorney General Todd Blanche in a tense meeting and warned that the controversy could derail a multi-year package for immigration enforcement worth around $70 billion. That is the key point. This wasn't just grumbling. This wasn't just senators venting to reporters. This was institutional resistance. A president wanted movement. The Senate slowed it down. A White House team showed up to reassure Republicans. Instead, senators grilled them hard. Even Trump ally Tom Cotton reportedly pressed officials with point-blank questions like, "Who thought this was a good idea? Who chose this timing?" That matters because power in politics is not measured only by rallies, social media posts, or primary endorsements. It is measured by whether lawmakers actually move when you tell them to move. And this week, they didn't. At least not automatically. At least not cleanly. At least not without a fight. The New York Times adds an even deeper layer to this story. It argues that this clash reveals the limits of the uneasy post-January 6 truce between Trump and congressional Republicans. That matters a lot, because after January 6th, many Republicans initially blamed Trump. Privately and publicly, they feared for their safety. They saw the violence. They understood the gravity of what had happened. But when it became clear that Trump still dominated the Republican base, most of them backed away from confrontation and fell back in line. The truce was always awkward and incomplete. Trump remained powerful. Republicans remained dependent. But the emotional scar of January 6th never fully disappeared. This week reopened it. New York Times, that is why the Bill Cassidy subplot matters so much. Senate Republicans reportedly gave Cassidy a standing ovation behind closed doors after he lost his primary to a Trump-backed challenger. Think about what that means. They were applauding a senator Trump had just helped politically destroy. A senator targeted in part because he voted to convict Trump after January 6th. That standing ovation was not just about Cassidy. It was a message, a signal, a release valve, a sign that beneath the surface, many Republican senators are far less comfortable with Trump's politics than they usually admit in public. And then came the fund, which, in their eyes, threatened to force them right back into the ugliest moral and political territory of all, January 6th. Police assaults, Capitol violence, and whether the Republican Party wants to tie itself, again, to that legacy. Now here's the part where a lot of commentary goes wrong. People hear Republicans are rebelling and assume Trump is collapsing. That may be too simple, maybe far too simple, because several reports also make clear that Trump is still extremely powerful in the broader Republican Party. CNN notes that Trump's allies believe he remains emboldened by recent primary wins and still runs the board in Republican primaries. That means senators might dislike his moves. They might fear the politics. They might hate the timing. But they also know he still has enormous influence over Republican voters. So the real story is more nuanced. Trump may still dominate the base. But dominating the base is not always the same thing as controlling the Senate. Those are related forms of power, but they are not identical. A senator facing re-election thinks differently than a primary voter. A senator thinks in maps, coalitions, margins, suburban swing counties, independent voters, media cycles, committee schedules. And when senators believe a president's obsession with personal revenge is threatening all of that, they can start resisting, even if they still fear him. That is why this week could be important. Not because Trump suddenly lost the Republican Party. He didn't. But because the Senate may be signaling that there are conditions now. Limits. Red lines. At least on issues that expose members to severe political risk. Every major article points, directly or indirectly, to the same underlying force, the midterms. That is the clock ticking in the background of this whole drama. Republicans are not just debating policy. They are debating political survival. If they lose control of Congress, Trump's second-term agenda becomes harder. Oversight intensifies. Legislative momentum collapses. Internal blame explodes. That is why senators are panicking over anything that looks like a self-inflicted wound. The LA Times captures this well. It frames the moment as a test of the limits of Trump's grip during an already tense political environment before the midterms. And it notes that many Republicans feel under siege, squeezed by unpopular issues, rising costs, foreign policy strain, and proposals they do not want to defend in an election year. This matters because parties usually tolerate a lot when they are winning. They tolerate chaos, ego, drama, even scandal. But when they think they might lose, tolerance drops fast, and discipline becomes the demand. That is the shift we may be seeing now. Not a moral awakening across the board, not a sudden rediscovery of principle, but a fear-based recalculation. A sense that if Republicans do not change the narrative, voters may punish them for it. So why should anyone outside Washington care? Because this is not just a congressional soap opera. It is a live test of how power actually works inside the United States right now. Can a president who dominates his party's voters still lose leverage with elected officials when his agenda becomes too politically costly? Can fear of Trump outweigh fear of the general electorate? Or is that balance starting to change? This also has geopolitical implications. If the White House cannot command automatic loyalty from its own Senate majority, then every major issue becomes more volatile. Immigration funding becomes harder. Iran-related war powers become riskier. Budget fights become messier. And foreign governments watching Washington may conclude that Trump's domestic control is less solid than it appears on television. In global politics, perception matters. Allies watch for weakness. Adversaries watch for division. Markets watch for instability. And this week delivered all three. A divided governing party, a delayed legislative agenda, and fresh uncertainty over whether Trump can keep congressional Republicans in line when it really counts. Here's the honest answer. Maybe, but not everywhere, and not all at once. Trump still looks dominant in primaries, still commands deep loyalty from a huge share of Republican voters, still has the power to punish dissenters, still shapes the emotional center of the GOP. But this week showed something important. That power is not infinite. It can meet resistance, especially when Republican senators believe Trump is asking them to walk into an electoral minefield for the sake of his personal grievances. So maybe the better way to say it is this. Trump is not losing the Republican Party, but he may be losing the assumption of automatic compliance. And in politics, that is a very big deal. Because once lawmakers realize they can push back, once they see others doing it, once they discover the political sky does not immediately fall, rebellion becomes easier the second time, and the third, and the fourth. That is why this moment matters, even if the immediate controversy fades. The precedent is the story. Senate Republicans resisted, publicly, collectively, and on an issue tied directly to Trump's deepest political instincts, retribution, loyalty, and rewriting the meaning of January 6th. So watch what happens next. Watch whether the fund survives in anything like its original form. Watch whether Senate Republicans keep blocking or reshaping Trump's agenda. Watch whether Trump retaliates harder against dissenters. And most of all, watch whether this week was an exception or the start of a pattern. Because if this pattern grows, the biggest political story in America may no longer be whether Democrats can stop Trump. It may be whether Republicans, at least some of them, are finally starting to do it themselves. And if that happens, the consequences won't stop at Capitol Hill. They will shape the midterms, the balance of power, America's legislative capacity, and how the rest of the world reads the strength or weakness of Trump's presidency. Because sometimes the most important shifts in politics do not begin with an election. They begin with a hesitation, a delay, a closed-door confrontation, a few senators deciding they've had enough. And this week in Washington, that may be exactly what we just saw.